Before we roll, if true survivor stories deserve a voice, subscribe to the story Beyond the Impact, tap like, and tell someone who loves aviation that this episode just took off. I remember the date the way you remember a scar. 8th January 1989, a Sunday that carried the soft fatigue of Christmas packed back in cupboards. British Midland Flight 92, Heathrow to Belfast, a Boeing 737-400 still smelling of new plastic and promise. I was seat 9A, left side, a window shaped like a porthole to a world I thought I understood. I'd told my mother I'd be there by bedtime. I'd told myself that life could be planned with the tidy confidence of a timetable. We pushed back under a sky the color of wet slate. In those days, I loved the lull of taxi and the soft punch of takeoff that reset something inside the chest. We climbed into cloud. The aisle lights were small constellations. The trolley had not yet played its music against the galley floor. I watched the wing, the way I always did, for the honest language of airmanship. Flaps stepping back into the arm, ailerons fluttering their little corrections like eyelids. Then the aircraft shivered. Not the lazy shrug of turbulence, but a vibration that made my plastic cup chatter and turned the cabin into a tuning fork. A smell came, hot and wrong, a chemical breath that doesn't belong to people or food or rain. We looked at one another with the politeness of the British confronted by the impolite. We blinked. We pretended to ignore it. We knew. I pressed my palm to the sidewall and felt the kind of tremor you can't lie about. Somewhere up front, a decision was happening. The seatbelt sign chimed back on. A voice followed. Measured, professional, the cadence of calm lent out on credit. We were diverting. A precaution. The nearest suitable field. The name East Midlands meant nothing to my geography then, only a promise of runway and ground. I watched the wing because it was the only part I could love with my eyes, and I listened to the engine note with the attention of someone listening through a wall for a heart that may or may not be steady. People say afterwards that time stretches or snaps. For me, it focuses. The aisle grew narrow with purpose. Cabin crew moved like rehearsed grace, faces set to the work of making strangers into a single organism. We were coached, belts tight, shoes on, loose items stowed. A man across the row kissed a St. Christopher he hadn't looked at in years. A woman folded a pram leaflet with meticulous care and tucked it into her coat as if paper could be kept safe from weather. The soundscape changed again. A thinning at the edges, a note in the engines that felt like someone trying to speak and choosing silence instead. We turned. I could feel it in my stomach, that slow bend of intention. A line of motorway lights slid into view, unwinding like a necklace along a black throat. The words "prepare for crash landing" arrived over the PA like instructions for a ritual none of us had believed we'd perform. We bent to brace, hands to the back of the seat, head bowed to a god called physics. Impact is two things, a sound you don't forget, and a rearrangement of reality that happens faster than thought. The tail kissed the sodden earth first, then the mains. Then we were a sentence breaking against punctuation. The cabin became confetti of plastic and light. Over my shoulder, trees scissored into view, too close, too green for January. The aircraft broke, not in rage, but in logic. Nose, center, tail-parting company with the dignity of a thing still doing its job as long as it can. We slid past the M1, a hard band of tarmac that could have been teeth, and stopped on the embankment in a posture that would look like theater in photographs, and felt inside like the end of a long argument with gravity. Silence is a liar after a crash. It only sounds like silence. In it, there are 1,000 small noises. Drips, ticks, the hiss of a life that has decided to continue. Someone sobbed as if afraid of waking a child. Someone laughed once, a bark of shock that immediately apologized for itself and turned into breath. The aisle was a corridor of decision, crew shouting clear and come this way, strangers holding strangers upright by elbows and names learned in the impact. Smoke has a personality. This one wasn't furious, just present. The door opened onto wet air and lights that belonged to a world that hadn't expected us. We climbed down a slide that felt both too fast and too slow. The ground was greasy with rain and jet fuel. I turned back and saw our 737 in 3 parts, its insides on the outside. And my mind, traitorous with knowledge from documentaries, whispered how close runway lights had been, how brief the distance between almost and not. Blue lights stitched the perimeter. A fireman shouted, and his voice sounded like a home I didn't know I'd been missing. A paramedic touched my wrist and found a pulse that wanted to gallop. I kept saying, "I'm all right," because that is what you say when you're not sure who might need the comfort of the words more. You or the person with a job to do. Later, in a building made of fluorescent tubes and old tile, we were counted and banded and handed cups of tea that steamed like absolution. The crew came through like people stepping out of a painting into a kitchen, their faces still in the afterlight of duty. We learned the words Kegworth and embankment, and short of the runway from televisions that spoke about us as if we were myth. We learned there were dead. The room absorbed it with a particular British quiet, and many alive. We learned that the pilots had both been hurt, that rescuers had crawled through metal like miners returning from a seam of tin. In the first hour, rumor fought fact, and fact, lacking its shoes, limped. Someone said an engine had exploded. Someone else swore the wrong one had been shut down. A third insisted both were true. I didn't want to know yet. I wanted to be a body in a chair, breathing like work. A man with a notebook asked what I'd seen. I said lights, trees, hands. A motorway that minded its own business as an aircraft became geography beside it. He asked if I'd smelled smoke. I nodded. He wrote that down and made it a sort of victory, as if evidence were oxygen. When he left, a nurse adjusted the blanket on my knees with the kind of thoroughness that can only be called love when it's given to strangers for free. That night I slept for 7 minutes at a time. In between, I scored and replayed the last 60 seconds of our descending arc and tried to make it land a different way. It wouldn't, and perhaps that is mercy. Even in imagination, physics keeps its boundaries to save you the temptation of magical thinking. In the morning, the sun made liars of us all by being ordinary. Reporters gathered, officials spoke, a phrase appeared and repeated like a chant. Investigation ongoing, the words felt like a stretcher for the soul. I didn't know then that the investigation would become the second narrative, the long tale of the first impact. I didn't know that some people would want it to end quickly with a neat blame, or that others would be asked to see further than a cockpit, further than a brace position, into choices made long before any of us boarded. I only knew I was alive. And that being alive after a night like that felt like being borrowed from something larger than yourself. Hospitals discipline chaos. They lay it on white sheets, label it, route it to rooms. I learned to sleep while machines talked to one another in green lines. I learned the geography of fracture clinics, the names of bruises, the way a stranger's hand can count as family. Outside, the news learned our names. Kegworth, Flight 92, Boeing 737-400, and began to practice its scales, cause, consequence, culpability. The first draft of the story arrived fast. The crew had shut down the wrong engine. The sentence is true. It is not the whole truth. But the first time I heard it, I felt the old chill move through the room, the way cold air will find a hole in a window you thought you'd fixed. It sounded like a verdict. It landed like a shortcut. I had watched our cabin crew turn fear into work. I had heard a voice up front steer us into a descent you could call composure. I didn't know yet about fan blades, about vibration indicators and bleed air plumbing that had changed with the new series. I didn't know that the smell through my nostrils had drafted the cockpit into a misleading memory of older aircraft. I only knew that the world likes a simple sentence, and this day was a paragraph that needed commas and context. Enter the man who wouldn't accept brevity. I never learnt if his stubbornness was a job description or a personality trait. To me, he became the investigator, a composite in my memory of voices from the AAIB, engineers with pens behind ears, and a quiet northern patience that treats truth as a craft, not a prize. He visited the ward with shoes that apologized for their noise and a notebook that looked like it kept its own counsel. He asked not what I felt, but what I noticed. Where did you sit? What did you hear before the smell? Which way did the vibration travel through the floor? Did the cabin crew point left or right when they spoke to one another? He collected our answers as if they were rivets and promised nothing but work. Out in the public square, the narrative wanted to arrest 2 men and go home. The airline required a story that could fit into a press release. The manufacturer needed confidence to outshout new aircraft teething problems. Everyone, including me, needed sleep. The investigator started asking for time. He asked that training be looked at with unsentimental eyes, that instrument design be examined for what it invited pilots to assume, that communication between cabin and cockpit be judged not for its politeness, but for its effect. There were meetings that must have felt like holding your breath underwater. There were days the file wanted to close because the country likes to believe that cause is a singular noun. In those days, I learned how pressure dresses itself in politeness in Britain. With respect, says the person who wants you to agree. If we might expedite, says the person who wants you to stop thinking. The investigator said no by asking better questions. What did the 400 change from the 300 and 200? Where did the bleed air come from now? Why was the vibration gauge placed like a footnote when the auto-throttle could mask the very symptoms a human hand might have felt? Who decided that sim sessions wouldn't include realistic smoke cues in the forward cabin? Why did cabin observations of flames in the left exhaust stop at the galley instead of walking into the cockpit? When he visited me again weeks later, he brought not answers, but evidence that refused to stay quiet. A fan blade had failed in the left engine, leaving a signature inside the metal that only microscopes and stubbornness can read. Smoke had entered the cabin not from the right, as on older 737s, but from both sides, misleading those who had flown the older machine. The autothrottle had done what it was told, and in doing so had soothed the symptoms our bodies might have served us better by feeling. The vibration indicator, tiny, low, easily missed, had told the truth, but not loudly enough to overrule a memory. He didn't absolve the cockpit. He refused to isolate it. He asked the airline why conversion training had been thin where it needed to be fat. He asked the regulator why checklists read like hymns when they needed to read like tools. He asked everyone to stop asking the wrong question, who is to blame, and start asking the useful one, how did this happen, and how can we make it unlikely to happen again? Meanwhile, survivors were being given the kind of instructions people only hear in laboratories and courtrooms. Physio for bodies, paperwork for minds. We brought flowers to funerals and signed forms we never thought our names would sit on. We watched, with the helplessness of bystanders in our own narrative, as 2 pilots were held up to cameras. Injured, human, dismissed. Some called it justice. The investigator quietly called it incomplete. The report took time on purpose. It made recommendations, dozens, that sounded to a public keyed to drama like boredom. Recite this gauge, change this brief, train that scenario. Revise the brace position based on medicine, not myth. Boring, I have learned, is how safety wins. It is the price paid in peace, so that fewer prices are paid in catastrophe. When the report finally grew a spine and a cover, when the microphones were put away, a different kind of silence settled in. Not the official silencing that rumors are born to complain about, but the quiet that follows work well done. The case was not buried. It was built over with a stronger structure, but to a public that had already spent its interest on blame, it looked like an investigation that had been filed and forgotten. Years later, when someone refers to Kegworth as if it were a neat story about men making the wrong choice, I feel the old wind lick my ear. I tell them a different version, that choices live inside systems, that smell can lie and numbers can whisper from the wrong corner of the panel, that a crew is a human answer to loud machines and quiet assumptions. I tell them about an investigator who refused to declare the case closed when it was merely tidy. And I tell them what I learned from surviving, that truth needs advocates as much as people do. Sometimes those advocates wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear high-vis and carry spanners. Sometimes they carry a notebook and ask more questions than is comfortable. We didn't disappear that night. We arrived where we weren't expected and lived. But a simpler story almost disappeared us. Our complexity, our craft, our right to be more than a headline. The man who wouldn't accept it gave us back our size. If this opening grabbed you, drop a comment with "keep digging" or "never bury the truth." It helps this story reach more people who need it. The first time I saw the files, they weren't sacred. Brown archive boxes with those string ties, the kind that make you feel like bureaucracy once had hands. I was at a survivors liaison meeting, lukewarm tea, biscuits that tried their best, when the investigator arrived late, carrying one box like a midwife who knows not to hurry. He set it on the table and didn't open it, which was how I knew it mattered. Outside the room, the country had already built its neat sentence. Wrong engine shut down. It fit on a headline. It fit in a pub. It fit the human desire to point and be done. Inside the box was everything that broke that sentence into paragraphs, maintenance bulletins, photos of a fan blade's root with a crack that looked like a hair and behaved like a verdict, diagrams of bleed air that told a new story about how smell travels in a 737-400, and a cockpit layout where the vibration gauge lived low and little, like a footnote you shouldn't skip but might. He didn't show us gore. He showed us design. How one new system borrowed an old habit's clothes and then lied politely. On earlier 737s, the smoke cue for a fractured left engine favored the right side of the cabin. On the 400, distribution changed, but memory didn't. He traced the lines with a pencil that clicked against the paper, a heartbeat for a room trying to learn. They didn't just choose wrong, he said. They were persuaded wrong, by cues, by placement, by systems doing exactly as built. My body argued with him at first. It wanted the relief of anger, the hot clarity of villain and victim. It wanted a father called Pilot Error, so I could shout at him until he went away, but the box refused to let me off that easily. It contained engine test cell reports, lists of torque figures, memos from trainings where bullet points had replaced hands-on time because the new bird looked so much like the old one. A letter from a line pilot argued for a bigger place for vibration on the panel because auto throttle masks feel. A reply thanked him and did nothing because the schedule owns manners. The investigator asked for time and was given calendars. He asked for changes and was given committees. He returned to the box. "Listen," he said, as if the paper could talk, and in a way it did. When it finished, he turned to me like a doctor delivering good news that doesn't taste good. "The crew missed it," he said, "and the system helped them miss it. If we only punish the next crew, we'll miss it differently." After discharge, I went back to work, then didn't, then tried again with a body that had learned new rattles. On a bus, the diesel note at idle could fold me into brace if I wasn't careful. I learned to breathe on purpose. I learned the root of the scar I couldn't see, the one that runs from noise to thought. Letters arrived that wore politeness like armor, invitations to inquests, to briefings, to support groups. The room at the inquest had the acoustics of civility, every question phrased like a cup of tea. The airline wanted closure that didn't cost. The manufacturer wanted confidence. The regulator wanted trust without trouble. The investigator kept asking for detail and context and bones to go with the skin of policy. The questions he asked built a scaffold you could hang safety from. Why was the sim more cinema than chemistry? Why did the conversion brief rely on differences lists that assumed equivalences? Why were cabin reports of flame in the left exhaust treated like rumors instead of routed with urgency into the cockpit? Why were hands taken off the throttle when auto throttle could keep a bad engine sounding neat? He never raised his voice. He just kept arranging the evidence into a shape you couldn't ignore without admitting you liked your furniture more than your future. One evening, months on, I met another survivor in a pub that smelt of carpet and fried vows. She had a bandage's ghost along her hairline and a laugh that had decided to live. We spoke about everything except the thing until we finally spoke about the thing. They want it tidy, she said. We want it true. We lifted our pints to the difference. At home, I began a private practice. Write what happened without adjectives until the page looks like a checklist. Then add the feelings in the margins, like annotations. Bang, vibration, smell, turn, brace, impact, slide, hands, blue lights, names. In the margins, fear, shame for living, gratitude that embarrasses itself, rage with nowhere to go. On the last line I wrote, I am not a headline. The press tried to make me one once. They rang the bell and queued on the pavement, polite as a funeral. Just your truth, they said, which is what people say when they want the most sellable slice of it. I told them about hands, the crews, the paramedics, the investigators with his pencil, and they looked patient, the way you do when a witness insists on nuance. It didn't matter. The paper ran wrong engine, right stuff, and put it next to a photo of the embankment that made us look like a TV set. I learned how to say no with the trained voice of a cabin crew. Warm, immovable. The recommendations began to shake out of committees and onto the line. Reposition this gauge, reword that checklist, alter training to include realistic cues and vibration you have to notice on purpose. Cabin to cockpit language got sharper, less polite, more useful. The brace position was updated based on injury patterns, not old wives' tales. We were being rewritten in ways that made my bones feel consulted. Still, when the final report landed with its number and crest, the news treated it like a weather forecast. Glanced at, quoted, moved past. A few radio shows said words like systemic and multifactorial, and then asked if anyone had a cute dog on the line. The box closed, the string tied, the world continued, but memory is a mechanic. It listens for rattles. A year later, I woke at 3 a.m. to the silence that follows storms and realized it wasn't empty. It was work finished for the day. I went to the kitchen, found my card with the 3 lines I'd kept from Goose Bay News the year before, without knowing I'd need them here too. Listen to everything, believe behavior, decide human. Underneath, I added a 4th, new to me but old to aviation. Fix the system that fixes the people. The investigator never became a friend. He stayed what he should have been, a craftsman dedicated to a machine called truth. When the last meeting ended, he packed the box and left it with an archive that smells of paper and electricity. The string holds, the lid sits, but I know those pages keep talking to the people who need to listen. And me? I kept finding the motorway with my eyes. Every time I drove the M1 past Kegworth, I lowered the radio and let the sound of tires tell me I was still here. Motorways are the opposite of vanishing. They remember you even when you try to forget. At the verge, there's a memorial that doesn't shout. Names, a date, sky above it like a sheet freshly pulled tight. It isn't closure. Doors in this house swing on springs. They never latch by themselves. But the draft through them smells less of kerosene now and more of paper, ink and work. The first time I traced the map, not of counties but of pressure points, I used a biro on the back of a train ticket. It looked like a child's drawing and behaved like a compass. Pilot training in one corner, instrument design in another, maintenance culture, regulator appetite, press hunger, survivor voice. In the middle, a small circle labeled truth, as if naming it could make it central more often than not. I brought the sketch to a support group and we pretended not to be embarrassed by our homework. People added arrows. One woman, a nurse by profession, wrote time in capitals between every node. Without it, she said, everything is triage and propaganda. The room hummed a yes that felt like a vow. At home, the phone kept reminding me that neat narratives eat quickly. A TV researcher asked whether I could say, "The moment I knew we were doomed." I said, "I never knew that." He pivoted to a beat sheet about pilot error because beats are hungry. I declined, feeling guilty for not feeding a person who turned up with politely sharpened teeth. Later, when I couldn't sleep, I watched an old documentary about a crash in another country that had been done properly, with systems, not saviors. It calmed the part of me that thinks honesty is an endangered species. The investigator sent a letter that wasn't meant for me, but reached me anyway because some clerks believe in serendipity. It was a memo to a training department recommending a change to the SIM profile, add smell as a misleading cue, reduce auto throttle so hands can hear, move vibration into the hierarchy of loud. The last line glowed with the kind of boredom that saves lives. Repeat until boring. I pinned it to my notice board, a talisman against the sentry's need to be entertained. I visited Kegworth quietly, without the reflex of flowers. I stood by the embankment where we chewed through grass and cold and luck. The M1 did its work without ceremony. Cars are very good at not knowing your story. A robin landed on the fence like an accidental counselor. I told it nothing. I listened to wheels and learned again that freedom is the luxury of infrastructure working. People imagine survivors become activists. Some do. I became a nag. Polite emails to organizations when I saw a training video that lied by being too clean. A raised hand in a safety lecture when someone called a checklist a tick box. It's a map. Treat it like one. I spoke to a cabin crew intake class and told them the least cinematic truth I know. Busy beats brave. They wrote it down as if I'd taught them a spell. Maybe I had. It's the only kind that doesn't require magic. The airline invited a handful of us to see the changes. The new vibration display sat where a tired human could see it without praying for peripheral vision. The brief now said, "Verify by instrument, not smell," in a font that knew how to be looked at. The cabin drill for visible flame from engine exhaust included a route into the cockpit, a phrase for urgency that could cut through politeness without spilling respect. In the sim, the auto throttle stayed on a leash so that Feel could keep its license. We watched a crew run the profile. Nobody looked heroic. It was the most comforting thing I'd seen since the blue lights the night of the crash. Not everyone liked the new boredom. A manager grumbled that it slowed the day. An old captain muttered that we used to just fly the thing, and I wanted to hand him the memo that says just is not a procedure. The investigator, who always looked like he'd slept in a corridor to save time, said only, "Friction is progress in a factory that builds consensus." He was right. Every tug on the rope moves the knot. Years later, a young engineer wrote to say our crash was the reason she'd fallen in love with failure modes. "They're not villains," she wrote. "They're stories we haven't learned to hear." I wrote back that she should put that on a wall where students can't miss it. She sent a photo of a workshop with 3 words in stenciled paint. "Argue with assumptions." I hung it beside my card. People still ask for the moment. TV loves a pivot. Life is accumulation. The moment wasn't a bang or a smell or a brace command. It was an email months later saying a checklist had been rewritten because injury pattern data demanded it. It was a training log showing that crews now practiced misleading cues until they yawned. It was a regulation footnote promoted to a line item. I took those boring triumphs like vitamins. The families of the dead taught me the hardest humility. At a memorial, a father stared at the carved name as if the stone might give it back. He didn't want nuance. He wanted his son. I stood far enough away to give him privacy and close enough to share the weather. When he turned and saw my face, he nodded once, a treaty signed with eyes. He didn't ask what I thought of systems. He asked if I still flew. Yes, I said. He didn't say good, he didn't need to. Every anniversary the press calls, I say no more often than yes. When I do say yes, I tell the unfashionable truth. That policy is a love language, that revisions are apologies you can stand on, that training hours are candles you light where storms have been. I tell them that a country that loves queues should love checklists even more. At night, on bad weather evenings, when the city's roofs shine like scaled fish and the sky sounds electrical, I take out the map I drew and redraw it on fresher paper with fewer arrows. The lines have shortened. Pilot training now touches instrument design without detouring through ego. Maintenance touches regulator without a stop at deniability. The middle circle, truth, is still too small for the scale of the page, but it no longer feels like an aspiration. It feels like a hub. I don't make a hero of the investigator. He did his job. That's the point. The magic trick I saw wasn't genius. It was refusal to settle for tidy, to leave cues unexamined, to call people the problem when systems invited the mistake and culture escorted it to the runway. If you ask what the pressure map is for now, I'll say this. When the next loud day comes, and they come, because machines and humans agree to be imperfect together, someone will reach for a procedure written in the shape of mercy. And if they reach faster because of the work done in rooms with carpet and cheap tea after Kegworth, then we've won more than a headline. We've won seconds. Seconds a runway. I keep my card where I can draw it without looking. Before sleep, sometimes I recite it like a cabin drill for the mind. Listen to everything. Believe behavior. Decide human. Fix the system that fixes the people. I don't know if that makes me an optimist or just stubborn. Either way, it's how I fly the rest of my life. The first time I saw money inside our story, it wasn't a headline or a scandal. It was a sentence in a memo, 5 words that clinked like coins in a jar. Training hours to be optimized. Optimized is a polite word in Britain. It means we will ask time to do more than it can without breaking. I wasn't supposed to see the memo. It arrived folded inside a bundle of correspondence survivors get the way weather arrives, by season rather than choice. I read it at my kitchen table with the kettle clicking like a small patient metronome. Optimized, not increased, not deepened, not tested against what we now knew. I pressed my thumb to the paper as if warmth could push meaning to the right side of history. In hospital, I'd learned how pressure dresses in white coats. In boardrooms, it wears PowerPoint. The investigator had lifted the bonnet on the machine. Instrument placement, auto throttle masking, vibration buried like a footnote, and turned a scene of pilot error into a map of pressure points. The map didn't accuse, it connected. But maps require walking. I found myself in rooms I didn't belong in, briefings, stakeholder updates with biscuits set out like alibis. Executives spoke in the future passive, measures will be taken. Engineers spoke in verbs, move, test, verify. The difference between will and do could be measured in runway length. A union rep leaned over and whispered, "They want closure with a ribbon on it." I whispered back, "Give them checklists instead." The investigator, for his part, turned up with his box and his inexhaustible pencil. He didn't accuse people. He interrogated assumptions. "If the 400 is new," he would say, "stop treating it like the 300 with fresh paint." He asked why a simulator scenario still used cinema smoke cues. He asked where the vibration was on the panel when a human brain is already playing a 4-hand fugue with alarms and airspace. He asked how cabin reports of flame on the left were filtered on their way to the right ear up front. Each question made a tiny sound like a ratchet, click, 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 tightening the system so it would hold. Meanwhile, us, the ones who had ridden the sentence into the embankment, carried our small aftershocks into ordinary life. I flinched at diesel at idle, smelt hot plastic on a bus, and braced for a runway that wasn't there. I learned to say, "It's only the heater," aloud in a kitchen late at night so my body would learn the new briefing, perception, cross-check, behavior. In a support group in a municipal room with scuffed skirting boards, we traded homemade SOPs. One man kept a pack of mints to tell smoke from memory, peppermint to break the brain's shortcut. A mother taught us the trick of counting chair legs slowly until adrenaline stopped asking us to sprint. We were turning fear into procedure, one humble hack at a time. The letters came from lawyers too, multilingual in grief and money. There would be compensation, apportionment, words that tried to quantify a life as if it were weight you could place on a scale and announce as fact. I learned the rate at which courts pronounce justice. It is slower than the rate at which newspapers print blame. The numbers they offered me felt like a currency from a country I didn't live in. I used some of it to sit still, spare hours bought to attend briefings, to write letters, to nag in full sentences anyone whose job description let me in the door. One meeting stays under my skin. A senior manager presented a slide titled "Efficiencies post-Kegworth," the kind of phrase that makes language file for divorce. Underneath, bullet points marched: training consolidation, blended learning, awareness modules. I raised my hand with the politeness they teach you with cutlery and asked how many hands-on hours in the sim were being added to teach misleading cues, auto throttle masking, and vibration prioritization. He blinked. The room shifted the way a cabin does when someone stands before the seatbelt sign. The investigator didn't rescue me. He let the room feel the drag. Then he said lightly, "Her question is the checklist." It was the kindest ambush I've ever been part of. The slide changed at the next meeting. Outside that building, the world continued with breathtaking indifference. A lorry reversed into a loading bay. A pigeon conducted a seminar on crumbs. I stood on the pavement and let the ordinary save me. It's a kind of mercy that cities don't care about your disaster. They go on. Inside, I was aligning headings with wins. Outside, Britain was inventing lunch. There's a photograph of the memorial beside the motorway that sometimes appears on my phone as a surprise. The names and the date sit in stone like a list the weather has signed. I don't keep the photo to be sad. I keep it because it is accurate. The memorial refuses spectacle. It tells the truth at a civil volume. That's what we needed from the report, from the airline, from the manufacturer. Truth at the right volume, in the right place on the panel, where a human can actually see it when the day goes loud. Months became a year. The recommendations began to show up like punctuation in other people's sentences. Vibration moved, briefings rewritten, cabin cockpit language sharpened so urgency didn't have to fight through manners. Brace positions redesigned according to injury patterns, not folklore. It should have felt like victory. It felt like maintenance, the noble boredom of tightening what must not come loose. I took that feeling like a vitamin, and still, there were doors I couldn't open. Meetings where reputation kept a thicker carpet than learning. Interviews where producers loved my pain, but not my paragraphs. Posts online where strangers pronounced verdicts with the leisure of people on sofas. Every time pilot error returned as the whole story, I felt our plane tilt again, not toward Earth, but toward tidiness. I learned to answer with a line I can say without heat now. They made the wrong call for understandable reasons inside a system that helped them make it. We fixed the system so the next wrong call is harder to make. Some people heard blame shifting. Others heard a bridge they could walk. One afternoon, the investigator asked if I wanted to see the sim. I said yes, before my body had time to flinch. In the grey half-light of a warehouse that smelled of coffee and hydraulic fluid, I sat in a cockpit that was both stage and surgery. He ran the profile: climb, shudder, a hint of smell that arrived on the wrong side because of how the 400 breathes, a vibration bar, now moved up into sight. The auto throttle tamed so human hands could feel the lie. I watched a crew I didn't know practice choosing. They weren't heroic, they were busy. They verified by instrument instead of memory. They made time obey, and a minute that could have become a memorial became a non-event. When the motion stopped, I realized I'd been holding the armrest with the grip of a person watching a loved one cross a road. The investigator didn't ask how I felt. He asked, "What did you notice?" I told him, "The placement of the truth, the pace of the checklist, the tone of the call-outs, fewer adjectives, more nouns." He smiled the way men do when the train is finally on the right line. "Then it's worth the arguments," he said. On the way home, I wrote a new line on the card I keep where drivers keep their license. Budget safety, like fuel, not publicity. The kettle clicked its approval when I stuck it to the fridge. Every time I make tea, I see the ugly truth turned into a useful instruction. Optimized is fine when you're trimming hedges, not when you're teaching a human to outthink a system that can persuade as much as inform. I wish I could tell you the ledger changed its mind because of one meeting, one survivor's tidy speech. It didn't. It changed because a dozen dull fights made doing the right thing cheaper than doing the wrong thing beautifully. It changed because engineers are more stubborn than advertising. It changed because the investigator kept showing up with his box and asking the kind of questions that make money behave. In the end, the memos read differently. Not optimized, but expanded. Not awareness, but proficiency. Not we will, but we have. The ledger blinked and for once counted what counts. When I sleep now on good nights, which arrive more often than they used to, the dream doesn't take me to the embankment. It takes me to the sim, to a crew I don't know doing something that will never be on television because it is so perfectly boring. I wake grateful for expensive boredom. It is the opposite of a memorial. The day I took the right-hand seat, I wore ordinary clothes on purpose. Jeans and a jumper, not reverence. The instructor, an ex-line captain with the soft authority of someone who has watched midnight turn into morning more times than a calendar can measure, briefed me like a colleague. "You'll observe," he said. "Call out what you notice. If you feel your heart sprint, tell us. We'll make time obey." We stepped into the sim, an eggshell on stilts, white as a hospital corridor. Inside, it smelt faintly of carpet and ghost kerosene. The panels were lit the way winter mornings are lit when the sun is generous, just enough to separate shape from shadow. He strapped in 2 trainees. Profile, climb, unexpected vibration, misleading odor, auto throttle restrained. He looked at me. "You good?" I nodded and wished I hadn't brought my body to something my mind felt ready for. Takeoff roll, rotate, positive rate, gear up. The sim doesn't pretend to be romantic. It gives you a world you can work in. 3 minutes after liftoff, a sound, a shudder found the floor, then my forearms. Not violent, present. Then the smell, not at all like smoke in a kitchen, more like an argument between heated air and memory. My chest prepared to run, but the instructor's voice arrived like ATC, calm, clipped, deliberate. "Crew, identify, don't assume." The trainee flying didn't hunt for villains. He looked where our corrections had put the truth. The vibration display now in his eyeline, the engine instruments misbehaving in a way you can explain with numbers instead of with fear. "Left engine high vib," he said. The other called it back. Monotone like a hymn, not drama. The autothrottle tried to soothe. It had been told to stand down. I could feel the moment they chose to trust the instrument over smell, the split second where old aircraft habits, right side smell equals left side trouble, were overruled by design differences and a checklist written after our crash. "Confirm," the PF said, hand hovering, not yet on the fuel lever. The PM confirmed with 2 data points, and my heart, impolite, slowed to match their cadence. "Memory items complete," the PM said, and then the cockpit settled into the kind of busy that sounds like quiet to the untrained. "ATC call, turn back. QRH open, gauges cross-checked. Cabin informed in words that don't borrow terror to seem honest." I watched them do what our crew had been persuaded away from by a concert of cues that Sunday. They believed behavior. Numbers corroborated sensation. Smell was downgraded from judge to witness. The vibration bar, now large and high, took the place in the story it should have had all along. I could have kissed that little rectangle of pixels. Instead, I wrote in my notebook with a hand that had finally stopped shaking, "Placement is policy." Half an hour later, we were on the ground, a landing so unremarkable it should be minted and handed out as currency. The instructor paused the world and turned to me. "What did you notice?" The question has become a sacrament in my life. I gave him my list: cadence, confirmation, humility in the face of old instincts. He nodded, then added the line I hadn't had language for. "We buy time. Everything else is purchased with that." I wrote it between my other commandments in capital letters. "Buy time." "Again," he said, "because repetition is the throne room of safety." The sim reset. Same profile, tiny variations, because life adores variance. Again, the vibration, the odor, the temptation to point before you've looked. Again, the deliberate denial of drama in favor of method. I recognized the feeling that used to make me want to stand up in an aeroplane, that urge to do something unhelpful. In the sim, I did the most helpful thing I've learned since the crash. I stayed in my seat and noticed better. After the session, the trainees unstrapped with the modest relief of people who have made boring look easy. We stood in the mock-up aisle and spoke as if in a parish hall after a service. One of them, freckled, eyes young but old where it counts, asked what it was like. I told the truth that fits in the palm. It was fast, and then it was busy, and then it was slow because someone made it slow. He pocketed the sentence as if it were a pen he'd need later. The instructor walked me to the car park, through a corridor of humming machinery. "How's your body?" he asked. British men don't always ask that question like that. I told him, "Better." The smell didn't steal me this time. The shudder didn't pick the lock. "That's training too," he said. "We don't only train crews, we train witnesses to be useful to themselves." Outside, evening had lacquered the tarmac. A jet climbed somewhere beyond the roofs, a line of white scoring the blue like chalk. I stood and didn't brace. Nothing in me ran ahead to an embankment. I stayed at the sim door long enough to understand I'd just walked out of a kind of church. Not sacred, not mystical, but a place where ritual keeps chaos on a leash. We make actions into liturgy because the body needs choreography when the mind is being shouted at. On the drive home, the motorway behaved like a well-edited film. Junctions arriving on cue, brake lights signaling information rather than doom. I passed the Kegworth exit and did not narrate it to myself for the first time in years. The memorial existed, unchanged as all good memorials do. But inside me, a latch clicked that had been rattling since '89. The past sat down instead of pacing. It still lived with me. It no longer rented the master bedroom. At home, I boiled the kettle and wrote the day's lesson under the others on my card. Listen to everything, believe behavior, decide human, fix the system that fixes the people, buy time. I pinned the card back where it goes. Then I did a frightening thing. I booked a ticket I'd been avoiding, Birmingham to Belfast. Same arc, different chapter. I chose an aisle this time. Not because I fear windows, but because I wanted to measure trust by my willingness to not watch. When the day came, I told the purser quietly that I'd been in 92 and I might breathe oddly during climb. She nodded the way professionals nod, brief received, actioned if needed, and left me alone to be brave in private. We rolled, we lifted, shudder, no, just the honest tremble of a machine explaining physics to the air. The smell, coffee and new carpet. I touched the seat back ahead like a ritual and counted 10 breath cycles instead of runway lights. At cruise, the captain spoke with the low poetry of British understatement. Smooth ahead. The plane obeyed. So did my chest. I didn't toast the past with anything dramatic when we landed. I simply let my feet find the pavement and my phone find a text to the investigator that read, "Sim works." He sent back a single tick emoji, modern hieroglyph for job done. Then, after a pause, "Tell the boring truth whenever you can." I laughed out loud on the Belfast curb, and a taxi driver looked at me like I was late to a good party. That night, in a hotel room that smelled of shampoo and electricity, I slept without staging a courtroom for old noises. Morning came like an on-time departure. The kettle clicked, the card waited. The city asked nothing but ordinary things of me. I gave it what I owed, a body on a pavement going where it said it would. The hearing room smelled of carpet cleaner and raincoats. Rows of chairs, a jug of water, microphones that made every throat sound guilty. I had promised myself to speak like a checklist, brief, exact, no embroidery. Across from us sat the people who manage risk for a living, regulator, airline, manufacturer, each with their own weather system of paperwork. The families sat behind, holding photographs the way you hold a compass that still points north. When my turn came, I didn't tell the room how fear tastes. I told them what I noticed, the vibration that traveled through the floor before it found my fingers, the smell that arrived in the wrong place because the 400 breathes differently, the cadence of the checklists in the sim years later when truth had been moved up the panel into human sight. I kept adjectives out of it. The chairs listened. Questions followed in that British way that wraps blades in felt. Would you say, from a passenger's point of view, that the crew failed? I rested my hands on wood that had heard worse and said the line I'd practiced. They made the wrong call inside a system that helped them make it. We have changed the system so the same call is harder to make. A murmur, agreement or annoyance, I couldn't tell. The investigator did not look at me. He wrote something, which was his version of applause. Then came the slide I feared. Efficiencies post-Kegworth. Bullets marched, optimized hours, blended learning, awareness. Awareness is a candle. It does not hold a wing on. I asked how many hands-on sim sessions had been added to teach misleading cues, auto throttle masking, vibration priority, silence. Papers shuffled like birds in hedges. The regulator cleared a throat that had cleared many before. We are satisfied, he said, a sentence that can mean almost anything. The investigator leaned to his mic and, in a voice that made time obey, said, "We are not finished." The room tilted just a degree away from tidy. After lunch, the mechanics spoke. Their language had talk in it. They said move, verify, recite, repeat. No hymn words, only verbs. An engineer held up a windscreen diagram and traced the path of bleed air with a pen a child could have read. "Old Q misleads," she said. "Put truth where tired hands look." She made it sound simple because it is. After the hard thinking is done. When it was over, we filed out past the press pack. A microphone asked for a sentence that could be eaten cold. I gave them one I could live with. Boring is winning. A headline the next day called us ungrateful for not naming a single villain. I kept the clipping for one reason. It proved the story had finally slipped out of the shape the world wanted and into the shape it needed. That evening I walked beside the M1 where it threads past Kegworth. Trucks shouldered the dark like patient animals. A light drizzle gathered on the memorial stone and did not know it was being poetic. I read the names as if taking attendance in a class I refused to let the future skip. I put a hand on the cold and ran my small liturgy under my breath. Listen to everything, believe behavior, decide human, fix the system that fixes the people, buy time. On the drive home, I didn't check the mirrors for the past. It rode along anyway, seat-belted, finally willing to be quiet. The hearing hadn't healed anything grand. It had simply exchanged satisfaction for work in a room where satisfaction had often won. That is the kind of victory that doesn't trend. It lasts. I met the first officer years later by accident and arrangement. A fundraiser, a winter hall, tea in beige cups. He walked in without theatre, a little older than the picture in my head, carrying his profession with that unshowy neatness pilots have when they've had to earn uneventful days the hard way. We shook hands. Neither of us apologized for surviving in different seats. We did not talk about the minute everyone wants. We talked about practice. He said the sim had been rebuilt to tempt you into the old mistake and then teach your hands to say no. He said cadets now watched for vibration with the same hunger they used to save for engine firelights. "We buy time," he said, and smiled like a man laying down a card he knows will win because the game is finally fair. After he moved on, a cabin crew trainee hovered like a bird at a windowsill. "What do you do with fear?" she asked me, eyes frank. "Seat it," I said. "Belt it. Give it a job. Notice better, then get busy." She wrote "busy beats brave" on the back of her hand in biro and walked away like she'd been given a map. Life kept presenting lowercase bravery. A line engineer showed me the recited gauge on a parked jet and tapped the panel with affection. "Now it's where a tired brain looks," he said. A controller told me they'd changed a phraseology that once wasted seconds. The new words are ugly and therefore memorable. A union rep emailed to say training hours expanded in the latest budget after a spirited meeting. None of this will ever be a documentary. All of it keeps people. At home, I finally moved the newspaper box out from under the bed. Clippings, letters, minutes. The archive every survivor says they'll sort one day. I burned nothing. I filed what had become useful and let the rest be evidence of a country learning in public. The envelope from the sim kept its place on top. On it I wrote, in felt tip like a child decorating a cast, "Dignity before drama." Sometimes I still wake to a ghost of hot plastic in the air. It's fainter now. I open a window, not because the room needs it, but because I do. The night comes in with its municipal sounds, fox, siren, late bus sighing, and I remember that noise is not always a threat. It is often the world doing its job. On the anniversary this year, the memorial looked exactly as it should. Unexcited. A boy in a football kit traced the carved date with the seriousness children reserve for stones and dinosaurs. His mother read the plaque aloud and did not try to make meaning behave. We stood together long enough to make silence feel like company. On the way back to the car, I felt a small, precise joy I once would have distrusted. The joy of systems quietly improved. No medals, no speeches, just procedures that now fit the hands that use them, and training that takes the scenic route on purpose so the fast road is safe again. Before sleep, I took out the card I've carried since the earliest aftermath and added, in tiny letters along the bottom edge, "Budget safety like fuel, not publicity. Tell the boring truth whenever you can." I slid it back behind my ID. Tomorrow I'll board another flight and ask nothing heroic of anyone. I will accept water, count exits, and let ordinary men and women fly a machine that has learned to be kinder to its humans. If a chime sounds, I'll classify it. If my chest tries to sprint, I'll brief it. Aviate, navigate, communicate, even on the ground. The motorway hums outside like a steady engine. The country sleeps. The sky will be there in the morning, untroubled by our stories and yet changed by the ones we wrote into checklists. There is a peace in that, the kind that doesn't ask to be noticed. Lowercase courage, signed and dated. Enough. The investigator retired with no fuss. One line in a bulletin, a photograph where he looked like every engineer I've ever trusted. Pockets full of pens, a smile that belonged to results, not applause. He left behind a paper trail that smelled of toner and stubbornness, and a sky marginally kinder to the people who work in it. I sent him a card that said only, "You bought us seconds." He replied with a postcard of a lighthouse. On the back, "Use them." I kept using them in small ways. I taught my breath to hold a briefing instead of a prediction. I learned the weight of a normal chime in a cabin. Advisory, not omen. I let the motorway be a motorway again, and not a rosary of what-ifs. Sometimes a scent of hot plastic still trespassed at the edge of sleep. I opened a window and told the room aloud, "Kitchen heater, not bleed air." The difference between now and before was simple. I could name it. Names make time obey. Every so often a journalist would fish the river for a soundbite, anniversary pieces, the soft news slot that needs a clean moral. I said yes only when they agreed to show the boring wins. The vibration gauge moved to where tired eyes look. The brief rewritten. Verify by instrument, not smell. The sim that tempts you into error until you learn to say no with your hands. Some producers yawned. A few asked for the memo where optimized became expanded and put it on screen like a trophy. Those were the days I slept well. At the memorial, I read the names until mine felt properly small. A boy on a scooter asked his dad why there were flowers by a rock. Because people remember, the father said, and added nothing ornamental. We stood in weather together and let silence do the work of a prayer. Once, on a business flight, I found myself beside a young first officer dead-heading home, tie loosened, smile crooked with fatigue. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? But he saw the way I listened to the engines and said, "You all right?" I told him I was in 89. He didn't feed me comfort. He handed me procedure. "If you hear a chime and you don't know what it is," he said, "count to 5 and look for behavior. Panic is a bad instrument." I wrote it on my card when he wasn't looking. Count to 5. Look for behavior. The ledger, which had once hidden safety under PR, began to speak in the past perfect. We have added hours, we have recited, we have revised. Lawyers closed files not because grief was done, grief never is, but because change had been made, documented, taught. The headline, people moved on. The hinge people, mechanics, instructors, dispatchers, kept doing hinge work, and doors swung safely in ordinary weather. On a wet Tuesday in Manchester, I spoke to a class about stewardship. I held up my battered card like a relic found in a glove box. Listen to everything. Believe behavior. Decide human. Fix the system that fixes the people. Buy time. Budget safety like fuel, not publicity. Tell the boring truth whenever you can. Count to 5. Look for behavior. A girl in high-vis raised her hand. "What if the room wants tidy?" she asked. "Make it useful first," I said. "Tidy can wait." The last loose end was mine. I drove the stretch of M1 past Kegworth with someone I loved in the passenger seat, a person who had only known my story as a careful edit. We pulled over, not to perform grief, but to measure it. The stone was wet. The air carried diesel and damp earth. Lorries moved the country. "What do you see?" she asked. "Pressure turned into procedure," I said, "and people who refused to be the last word." We got back in the car, indicators clicking like metronomes. As I merged, I felt it, not closure. That's too American a word for a British motorway, but continuance. The minute that almost ended me had joined a system that keeps strangers alive. That is the best afterlife a minute can have. I drove on with the radio low, a country under the wheels, and a sky above that didn't owe me anything and gave me everything anyway. Distance, direction, and the quiet privilege of arrival. The last interview I gave was in a room that didn't pretend to be grand, municipal chairs, a microphone that had seen better December fates. The producer asked what I wanted people to do after hearing our story. I didn't say cry or applaud, I said practice. Practice noticing. Practice asking the longer question. Practice choosing busy over brave. I flew home that evening. Window this time. Right side, somewhere above the labyrinth of lights that is Britain finishing its work. The captain briefed with that modest confidence I've learned to admire. Weather good, alternate set, cabin crew ready. The trolley rumbled. A child negotiated for biscuits. The aircraft hummed its unshowy sermon about lift. We hit a wrinkle of air. The seatbelt sign chimed. My chest remembered and then remembered better. Count to 5. Look for behavior. The wing flexed, then settled. The smell in the cabin was coffee and wool. My hand stayed on the armrest. My mind stayed in the seat. I thought of the investigator in a garden somewhere, probably arguing with a lawnmower manual. I thought of the first officer who slowed the world long enough for us to survive a bad minute. I thought of Nigel's forearm, Proof that sometimes the lever you need is made of man. I thought of the boxes with string ties, the SIM resets, the memo where a single word swapped sides and took money with it. None of it heroic, all of it work. Final approach. The city rose to meet us with its patient geometry of streets and roofs. Spoilers up, flaps down another notch, quiet voices up front, reading a language I now half understand. Seconds a runway, I thought, and smiled at the truth of it. We touched with a murmur and rolled straight, brakes a tidy hand on a tidy shoulder. Reverse, idle, turn off. The cabin let go of its breath. At the door, I thanked the purser without saying why. She nodded like a person who keeps a ledger of small gratitude. In the jet bridge, the air smelt of rain and electricity, and that lovely nothing you get when nothing is wrong. Britain doing Britain. Back home, I slid my card behind my ID and added the last line I had been avoiding because it sounded too neat until it didn't. Arrive, then help someone else arrive. I pinned a copy by the kettle so morning would find it. Tomorrow I'll queue, board, sit, listen, classify, trust. I'll let people do their jobs. I'll do mine. Be a passenger who understands that safety is a conversation between systems and hands, held at a human volume. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you for treating nuance as a destination worth the fare. If stories like this help you breathe and think when the chime sounds, subscribe to The Story Beyond the Impact, tap like, and pass this episode to someone who believes that boring is a beautiful word. The runway lights will still be there tomorrow, so will we.